Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Thanks for joining another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. And we're delighted today to be joined by one of the most popular and interesting political figures in Illinois, our 10th Comptroller, Susana Mendoza. Susana is from Chicago, grew up there, went to high school in Bolingbrook, went to college in Missouri on a soccer and academic scholarship, returned back to Chicago, got involved in political affairs in her community, was elected to the Illinois General Assembly in 2000 at the age of 28. So she was one of the youngest member, if not the youngest member of the General Assembly, served for about a decade, was then elected city clerk of Chicago in 2011, and then was elected comptroller in 2016. She's done some very innovative things in the realms of transparency and disclosure, which has gotten a lot of national attention. She also was on campus here a couple of years ago and said that the comptroller's office was the coolest constitutional office in the state of Illinois. So we're going to ask her how she's able to blend efficiency and coolness, and look forward to a really delightful conversation. So, Madam Comptroller, thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me, John. Yes, that is true. I stand by my statement that the Comptroller's office is the coolest of all the offices, maybe the least known about. I always say it's the best office no one ever heard about, So, but hopefully we're changing that, and more people are realizing not just how interesting things are at the Comptroller's office, but what a really incredible impact a good controller can have on the state's finances and on people's well-being.
Well, let's get to that in just a sec, but let's talk a little bit about your background. Your folks, as I understand it, moved to Chicago from Mexico in the 60s. You grew up in Chicago, and then your family moved out to Bolingbrook.
Oh, we actually moved to Woodridge, Illinois. So I may be the only constitutional officer that has lived in Cook County, DuPage County, and Will County. Yes.
Well, so sort of play on the early years, what your folks did growing up, and just some of your early experiences in Chicago.
Sure. Thanks, John. Well, my mom and dad, as you mentioned, are both Mexican. They came from Mexico City, my mom, and my dad from Poza Rica, Veracruz, which is a coastal area in Mexico. But they, or I should say, they got married and they moved there. He's from San Luis Potosí, which is more towards the middle. But in any event, they married, fell in love. They fell in love, got married, moved to, had my brother Joaquin, who was born in Poza Rica, Veracruz, and then they moved to Chicago. So I have a second brother. So my oldest brother is Joaquin, who's a Chicago police detective sergeant. And my brother Carlos is married and lives in Las Vegas, actually, interestingly enough. But he was born in the United States in Chicago. And then I followed about a year and a half after that. I was born in 1972. So for those of you who are wondering how old I am, do the math. But 1972 in Chicago. And I'm very blessed to have had amazing parents that served as incredible role models. They were married for 33 years when, unfortunately, my dad had a massive heart attack. I was 22 years old. It was completely unexpected and, kind of changed the trajectory of my life, right? From being a kid who, had both parents, who had this amazing example in my house every day, who felt that everything was perfect in life to some extent, right? And then just not. And so I became very responsible at the age of 22. My parents had both retired on the same day, looking forward to their life. And my dad, within a year of retirement, had passed away. So it became a situation where I was really called to take care of my mom and make sure that she was okay financially, which meant I had to take on multiple jobs. And my brothers also stepped up and did what they could. But that's actually the time in which I got involved in politics. But prior to that, you should know that my parents raised us not trusting any politician. They came from Mexico and they left Mexico, and in large part because there's just such distrust in the political system there and lack of opportunity as a result of so much widespread corruption. And so my parents looked for a better life, like so many other immigrants do, for their kids, even more so than for themselves. And through their kids is that they were able to fulfill, what that American dream was for them. And so they moved us out of Chicago when I was about 8 years old because of the tremendous gang violence that we were experiencing. My brother Joaquin, who is a Chicago police officer, you can imagine that he's wanted to be a cop since he was a kid. And that was not a good mix in a gang-infested neighborhood. And so he was constantly trying to be recruited by gangs when that was the last thing he wanted to do. So there were threats involved if he didn't join. And my parents literally worried for our livelihoods. And one day someone got shot and killed pretty much right outside our door. And my mom said, that's just enough. You know, she couldn't take it anymore. She literally, I use the example of, I mean, she never served in battle. So like technically, you know, not the PTSD that you would think of, but in a way, you know, you grow up in this neighborhood where you're afraid to walk to school because you might get shot. And that's a very real fear. And it happens all the time still in parts of our city, unfortunately. And I remember very clearly how scared I was to go to school as a 7-year-old kid. And that's not right. And when my mom had had enough, she said, I can't take it anymore. Like, we have to get our kids in a safe environment. And so overnight, I'm not exaggerating, John, my dad worked at Brock's Candy. For those of you who might remember Brock's Candy, none of the kids, I think, but definitely the adults in the room. I have the cavities to prove it. But it was a great childhood, even with, you know, stressors that probably shouldn't be there ideally for children. But my dad had a friend at Brock's Candy who had a friend that was renting a house in Woodridge, Illinois, which is in DuPage County. And overnight, my parents, they packed up what could fit in the station wagon and took us to this house in Woodridge, Illinois, which was just such a change of an environment. And I woke up literally being in Pleasantville, where I wasn't hearing firecrackers that were actually gunshots. I was just hearing birds chirp. And I remember what a stark contrast it was. And it was still about a year before my mother let me play outside of the house. Think about that. I don't have a single memory of playing in the front of my house when I lived in Little Village, which is the community. It's a beautiful community, but unfortunately has significant gang violence. And I remember playing in my backyard with my brothers, with my mom and dad, but never in the front because it was just too scary. And so she still had, even in the suburbs, which literally felt like Pleasantville compared to where I was before, she still had this fear that something bad would happen to us. So it was about a year before she got beyond that. And we learned what it was like to be able to play outside, to be able to play, you know, ball in the street, to come in when the lights went off, right? And know that you're perfectly safe. That was an amazing experience for me. And then I also had access to a really good quality public school system, which was not the case when I lived in the city. My parents took us to parochial school because the public school system was just poor. And so I had the experience of knowing what it was like to be a little kid, scared to walk to school in the city, in what is really a beautiful, vibrant neighborhood where many people feel like they're prisoners in their own homes. And then to grow up in a safe environment with a good public school system, and the difference that made for a kid like me, right, of immigrant parents, who is now the controller for the state of Illinois, who's had multiple successes in my lifetime because I had access to a great public school education that also included a safe environment in which to grow up in. And so I feel that I'm in a unique situation, not just as a constitutional, but certainly even when I became a member of the State House. And that happened after I graduated college, that I moved back into Little Village, that same neighborhood that I'd always felt I'd been run out of by gangs. We're a good, hardworking family, totally not involved in any kind of criminal activity, yet we had to leave our neighborhood because we didn't feel safe. And I wanted to come back to that very same neighborhood once I succeeded and graduated from college, and to show that it wasn't my choice to leave, but it was going to be my choice to come back and try to make a difference. And that's when I started getting involved in politics, and then the rest is history. But as a state rep, I remember having this really unique situation where I remember what it was like to be scared walking to school and fearing for my life every day, and what it was like to grow up in a safe environment with a good quality education. And that's what motivated me to try to do that for other people, because no matter what zip code you're in this state or anywhere in the country, you should all have that same opportunity that I had when I moved to the suburbs. That should be the same opportunity for all the kids in the inner cities. And I think that we'd have a very different world if people just started off on equal footing when it comes to good quality education and a safe environment. So that's been a big motivator for me. I feel like I've lived both lives, so I can articulate those points and I can focus on policy that helps to get us a little bit better down that road. But that's been a challenge, and it's also been very exciting. And as you said, I spent 10 years in the legislature. At the time when I was elected, I was a baby. I was 28 years old and the youngest member in that chamber at the time. And then went on to become the first woman elected city clerk in Chicago. And I think that's super fun and exciting. And we did amazing transformation of that office, which then moved me to want to serve in a greater capacity as state controller. And certainly I couldn't be prouder of the achievements that we've had in relatively a short amount of time as controller. So I'll stop talking there.
Well, as a state rep, let's talk about that a little bit. As you said, you're 28 years old. What were some of the issues you worked upon? And also, I was just wondering, did you come across a state senator from Chicago by the name of Barack Obama, either in the Capitol, or did you have any kind of encounters with him?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, we served at the same time. I was in the State House and he was in the Senate at the time. And there are many instances where we crossed paths. I have a lot of fun photos from those days, We both had no gray hair at the time. I color mine now. He's very bold and wears his gray very fashionably. But yes, we were great colleagues. And I think it's really fun. And it's such a source of pride to see how far he's come to the highest pinnacle that anyone could ever hope and dream of, right? So super proud. But going back to my days as a state rep, there were a lot of issues that I cared about. Obviously, making our streets safer, investing in education. Early childhood education is of critical importance to me. I'm very passionate about it. I did a lot of programs involving and push for a lot of funding for early childhood education. And one of the bills that I'm the proudest of during my time in the state legislature was that I'm the person who sponsored and got passed the bill that requires school breakfast across the entire state of Illinois for all schools that are, at the poverty threshold, or like 40% or more of their population is eligible for free and reduced lunch. So prior to that, it was like a wish that a lot of parents had that, there's a lot of poverty out there. And it's not just in the inner city neighborhoods. It's all over the state of Illinois. In rural Illinois, we see a lot of folks that struggle to be able to even put food on the table for their kids, and a lot of kids that go to school and they're hungry. And how do you possibly concentrate and do well on tests or on lesson plans if you can't even think because your belly's grumbling? So, I feel no matter what we think about people's circumstances and where, groups would want them to be, we shouldn't pick on kids, right? We should do everything we can to help those children, regardless of what their family situation's like at home. And so I felt very passionate about making sure that at least, trying to get kids on a better footing at school, which makes them more competitive, right? And be able to use their brain power a little bit more and set them up for a better life down the road, that breakfast was an important part of that. And I know that the person who had been there before me was unable to do that. And that was a passion of mine. So I got it done in my first legislative session, and the rest is history. So I'm super proud. As a legislator, you can sink your teeth into issues that truly change people's lives. I'll give you another example. It wasn't mine, but I just saw at Lieutenant Governor Corinne Wood's service the other day. A lot of colleagues could not go because they were in session, but I drove down from Springfield to pay my respects to our first female lieutenant governor, who is of the Republican Party, Corinne Wood. And I saw Representative Beth Colson, who, I don't know if you remember her, John, but I saw Beth, and I told her, every time I hear of a baby that was turned in to a fire department or a hospital, right, as part of the safe haven law, which she passed, I think, I served with Beth. I served with her. I remember those days. I got to vote for that bill. And you literally saved so many babies' lives across the state by just giving mothers who are at their wits' end and don't know how to handle this situation and could possibly think to do the worst, which is to get rid of a baby. How many babies have we found thrown away, literally? It's heartbreaking. But because of her bill, she's allowing that mother in that moment of crisis to hand that baby over to a safe place. And that baby can go on to either be adopted and have hopefully a great life, right? But you really have these opportunities, and they don't come along every day, but every day that you serve, you have an opportunity to make a big difference like that. Even if no one knows that you're the one who made it happen, that's not why you run for office. You run to get things done. And it's really fun for me to know what I've been able to do as a legislator, then as clerk, and now as controller, which maybe people will never realize, but that's not why you do it. And that's certainly not why Beth Colson passed that bill. But I will always, every time I hear a story like that, I think of Beth Colson and how heroic what she did as a state legislator was back then.
Well, so when you ran for city clerk in 2011, was it just the sort of notion maybe being closer to Chicago, and then also the challenge, more of a management challenge? Because I know you had you oversaw like $100 million in sales of vehicle stickers, and you did some real innovative work there. What was the impetus to run for city clerk?
So I'd say it wasn't to be closer to Chicago. I actually really love Springfield. I love traveling the whole state. So it was not an issue of I want to be closer to home. It was an issue of the challenge of running an executive office with hundreds of personnel. And truthfully, I remember when I left, I could have seen myself being a legislator forever because I loved the job. But I started to dislike the partisanship that was happening in Springfield. It started to become toxic, to be honest with you, John. And now we see the aftermath of that. It's so toxic right now. But as a member, I always had a really great time making friends on both sides of the aisle. I say that as a Democratic member of the House. I really thought it was important, if you want to pass your legislation, to gather as many votes as possible. And that means not just focusing on votes from Democrats, but also making the case for why your legislation, which will ultimately impact the entire state, should get buy-in from the other side of the aisle. And so I worked all of my bills. If you pull a record of the probably 90% of my bills from when I served those 10 years in the legislature, have 90%, if not more, have both Democratic and Republican co-sponsorship. And some of them have like a ridiculous amount, like 60 or 70 plus members that I would work on a bill to say, would you not just vote for this, but co-sponsor it because it's great legislation. And so I really had that work ethic and didn't just do it my freshman term, but kept that same work ethic throughout the entire 10 years that I was there, that my colleagues would say it was obnoxious and funny and awesome at the same time, right? So, but I just said, I'm never going to lose this habit. This is a good habit. And the day I start to think that I don't need to ask colleagues for their support because they're my friends and they're just going to vote my way is the day I shouldn't be there anymore, right? So I wanted to keep that level of work ethic going and showing that my bills mattered and that I was going to talk to everyone on both sides of the aisle about them. So, that was... I think I totally went off topic here. I don't even remember what I was talking about when I went into that diatribe. But at the end of the day, for me as a legislator, it was really important to get things done, right? I was never the kind of legislator that just introduced a bill to get a headline. I would rather not get the headline until after I passed the bill and said that we actually got something done. And I think that that's also proven to be the case. Oh, I remember. Yeah. As city clerk, I used to be a Chicagoan who had to wait in line 3 to 4 hours. John, I'm not kidding you. Ask anybody prior to me being clerk how long they had to wait in line to actually pay a tax, which is crazy. So we have this thing in Chicago called the wheel tax. And it's otherwise known in colloquial terms as the city sticker. And the city sticker is nothing but a wheel tax. It's actually a receipt that shows that you are in compliance with this wheel tax, that if you have a car in the city of Chicago for more than 30 days, you are supposed to be paying this tax on having this vehicle. And so the city of Chicago has had this tax since 1908. And for you Southern Illinoisans, prior to our more recent days, the Cubs had not won a World Series since 1908. And when I took office in 2011 as city clerk, they still hadn't won that World Series, right? So that's a long time. That's how long it had been since city stickers were sold on a seasonal basis in the clerk's office. So in 1908, when they passed this tax, that was because there were horses and buggies and a handful of Ford Model Ts that hit the roads. And all of a sudden, the roads started to take some major damage. So they said, well, let's come up with this tax to pay for fixing the roads. And then that tax continued and people would buy it in the month of June. And so 105 years later, when I took office, they still sell the sticker. But now it's 1.3 million vehicles, not a handful of cars, right? It's 1.3 million vehicles. all having to renew their city sticker or their wheel tax in the month of June. So you can imagine, like, there's no way to do that well. There's no way. So city tickers would take, if you mailed in your application, it would take like 2 to 3 months if you were lucky to get your sticker back. Usually you'd get your sticker back after it had already expired and people would get ticketed, and there was upset Chicagoans over this. But also if you went in person to get it, it would, I'm not exaggerating when I say 3 to 4 hour long lines. They would be completely in a queue, like if you were at Great America or at a theme park. And then they would go outside of my office into a hallway at City Hall, and sometimes outside onto Washington Avenue. And that's how long the lines were. And so people hated it, but they were used to it. And it was like this annual pilgrimage to go pay for this tax. And I said, I want to change that. And I know that I can do it. I remember being in that line going, there's got to be a better way to do this, right? Never thinking that someday I'd run for clerk, but I had the opportunity when there was an open seat, and I said, why not? I can get stuff done. I know what I'm capable of doing. So I went there and I said I was going to change it. Nobody believed me, but of course we did. Now in Chicago, there are no more 3 to 4 hour long lines to buy a city sticker. It's 5 to 10 minutes on a bad day. You can do it online. I joked around that you can do it in your pajamas or in the buff, whatever floats your boat, but just do it. And we sell a 1 or a 2 year sticker. So you don't even have to interact with our office more than necessary, because government should make life easier for people, not harder. And so I took that drive and that idea, and I took the risk, which nobody was willing to do, John. And that's a key differentiator between me and other elected officials or politicians, is that I think people are talking about all the wonderful things they want to do when they run for office. And they're massive risk takers. Oh, I'm going to take on the system, or I'm going to do this or that. But then the minute they get elected, they become risk averse. Oh, no, I can't do that. It might affect my next election. And so all the things that you want to do that would really impact change require significant risk. And I took on the risk of maybe rolling this out poorly, but I knew we wouldn't, and we didn't. And now Chicagoans are better off for it. So, and by the way, we raised a ton more money for the city without asking people to pay more out of their pocket, just by having a more streamlined, efficient, and more responsive system to taxpayers. So I'm super proud of that. And that's kind of the initiative and the mentality that I've brought into the Comptroller's office of handling the worst economic crisis that any controller has ever had to manage through. And I would say doing it very successfully, and now getting us to a point where we can breathe again. And we're actually very actively trying to pursue a credit upgrade for Illinois. Who would have thought just, 5 years ago, worst fiscal crisis in the history of our state. And right now we're asking for a credit upgrade, which I think we deserve.
Well, I'd like to drill down on the comptroller job. And I want to do it a little bit indirectly. About a year ago, we had Pete Buttigieg in this program and had a great conversation with him. And I'd read his memoir to understand his political career better. And I want to read a couple sentences because I think you can see where I'm going. He was saying, he says, no one sits on his mother's knee and says he hopes one day to become state treasurer. The truth is that I made it through my schooling and early adulthood without ever noticing the job existed or giving it much thought. Yet by the time my 28th birthday approached in early 2020, I decided to quit my job and spend the better part of the year in my savings seeking an obscure office that paid about half of what I was already making. I'm thinking about, I suspect when you were growing up in Chicago, being comptroller was probably not the first thing. But tell us what drew you into the challenge of running, and also a little bit about the job. And a lot of people maybe are not particularly clear about the difference between the comptroller and a treasurer, what the two offices do differently.
Sure, and I totally would reiterate what Pete Buttigieg said, who I'm such a super fan of. I love him. But it's so true. Nobody wakes up saying, I want to be treasurer or I want to be controller. I grew up with parents who disliked politicians immensely. I never in my wildest imagination would have thought I'd ever be an elected official. Are you kidding me? So this has all been surreal for me in many respects. But in terms of the controller's office, look, I knew what it was like to run an executive office. I love the state of Illinois with all my heart. I truly do. And to see what was happening in a state that I spent 10 years as a legislator and see its dysfunction at the highest level I'd ever seen it, and also knowing what I'm capable of doing if given an opportunity to lead, when we were going through the Rauner wreckage, as I call it, because it was a terrible time for Illinois. And I'm saying this not to be partisan, because you just heard me say how much I believe in being bipartisan and working with the other side of the aisle to get things done. And I was very much proud of that bipartisanship over the 10 years in the legislature. But then to see how we just devolved into chaos every day, and that we had a governor who, in my mind, was actively trying to wreck our state's finances in what I believed was an attempt to help many of his wealthy hedge fund managers who, if we were to actually go into junk bond status, would have benefited from the state's financial demise. And I know that that's really like out there to put that out there like that, but I've been proven correct, because we actually years later got sued by John Tillman and a hedge fund manager, because the actions that I took as controller in helping our state become more solvent hurt hedge fund managers. So what I had been saying was true. Now, rewind it again. I'm seeing all this happening in our state, and my dear friend Judy Bartopinka, who, again, a Republican and a Democrat can be friends. This is possible. She died very unexpectedly, in 2014, December 10th of 2014. She passed away after being reelected, but before being sworn in. And so then Governor Rauner was given, as the new governor, the appointment power, and he chose her successor. Now, unfortunately, that successor served nothing like Judy Bartopinka, who is very bipartisan, but also, even though she was a Republican, would call out members of her own party and disagree publicly if it was in the best interest of taxpayers to do so. On the other hand, the prior controller, her successor, just did whatever Governor Rauner was asking her to do, even at the expense of hurting people. And I don't just say that willy-nilly. We have the facts to prove as much. So how you prioritize payments to people who are begging for money because the state has not paid them in months or years is critically important. And it says whether or not you have a moral compass. Do we prioritize high-priced consultants the way Comptroller Munger did? Or do we prioritize nursing homes and hospice care and people with disabilities the way my administration does? That's what you should do, especially in times of fiscal crisis. So I was really just disgusted by what I was seeing happening in the controller's office and what I was seeing happening in the governor's office. And I felt that the state of Illinois was at its worst point of crisis in its history, certainly in my lifetime. And I thought, I can't just sit by and watch it happen. Now, I'll tell you, John, when I decided to run for controller, everyone who loved me, my family, my friends, political supporters, right? They were like, are you crazy? This is the worst time on earth to run for controller. It's like a job that nobody knows anything about. It's the hardest job in government right now, because the governor was completely an absentee governor whose only actions were to hurt our state. And you're going to have to work with that guy who hates Illinois, right? Essentially, like, you're going to have to work with this guy. How is that possible? Or you're going to be fighting with him all the time. This is going to be the worst job in the world. And I said, well, that's exactly why I want to run for this job, because for me, it's not fun. If people who truly know me know that I will not enjoy a job that is like, show up, turn on the lights, everything's smooth, everything's okay, go home and call it a day. I love to be challenged. And at that moment in time, there was no greater challenge in government than running for state controller in Illinois. So of all the constitutional offices, that was the most challenging. It was also the most rewarding, because I knew that if I was given an opportunity, I would be able to change things around and improve the dynamics for our state, get our fiscal house in as much order as I could within my power, and take on Governor Rauner. Everyone seemed to be so scared to take on this, almost billionaire governor who had threatened everyone's political careers. Well, I wasn't. I was excited about that opportunity to take him on. And I did feel like I was fighting out of my weight class every single day as controller, but I was winning those round after round after round. And at the end of the day, when I won, Illinois won, because we were able to stop him from continuing the damage on our state. We now have a new governor. Most importantly, as I said, I inherited a backlog that got as bad as $16.7 billion. And for folks listening, this is important, because when we talk about all these huge numbers, people's eyes gloss over, and it's hard to even wrap your head around what is $16.7 billion. It's so much money. But what it meant was, it's not a number on a spreadsheet. For me, $16.7 billion of a backlog means that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the state of Illinois who entered into contracts with our state to provide services in good faith, yet were made to wait to get paid for those services under Governor Rauner's tenure for 2 years or more. Think about that. You've turned people who are working hard to put food on their family's table into unwilling lenders to the state of Illinois, all the while pretending to be pro-business, when in fact you're putting people out of business by not paying them on time. And so those are real stories of people like my dear friend, I call her Mary, just to keep her name private, but who reached out to me the day I was sworn in to say that if the state of Illinois did not pay for her ventilator services, she would be disconnected 3 days before Christmas, right? Essentially a death sentence. This is how bad things had devolved in Illinois, where we were disconnecting people from ventilators because the state was not paying its bills on time. So, thankfully we got that turned around. Mary was okay, but this should never happen. And I felt like I was thrust into this situation where the controller of the state of Illinois, the state's chief fiscal officer, the person who's supposed to pay the state's bills, was essentially put in a position where you're making life and death decisions on a daily basis during that budget impasse. And so I get very passionate when I talk about this stuff because it's infuriating to me to know how many people were hurt because of ridiculous politics. And the state, while every other state in the country took advantage of the best bull market in our nation's history, Illinois got 8 credit downgrades in a row before I even got elected controller. And that's what I've inherited and have had to work on fixing. So I've got my hands full, John, but that's why I ran, because I have a little bit of a fireman's complex. I don't run away from fires. I run towards them, and I like to put them out.
Well, I saw in one interview you likened yourself to Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life in terms of, the run on the savings and loan and figuring out who got what. And I'm wondering just mechanically, how much discretion does the comptroller have as bills come in? Can you prioritize on the basis of urgency, or is it just strictly a chronological thing where the bill that arrives first is paid first? How does that work?
No, I have full discretion, John. So once those vouchers get sent to my office, I have the discretion of prioritizing them. And that's why it's so critically important to elect a controller with a strong moral compass. Because I brought to light soon after taking office that 4 days before I took office, my predecessor prioritized about $73 million worth of general revenue funds. So those are the very small amount of funds that I have on any given day to pay certain bills, right? It's they're not already earmarked for some specific purpose. So for example, if there's a nursing home that's about to close and they need help on their payroll, I could utilize general revenue funds to send that payroll to avoid them closing or not paying their employees, right? So emergency purposes types things. And she took $73 million from the general revenue fund to pay for Deloitte and other high-priced tech consultants who hadn't even delivered on their technology projects yet. And so you tell me if that's correct. I will tell you, regardless of what party you're in, that's not okay. We literally had nursing homes and hospice care, those that treat the most vulnerable people in our state, waiting 6 to 9 months to get paid from that office when high-priced consultants were getting paid first. That's just wrong. And so, no, I immediately on day one changed the prioritization of our office. And we said the first people that get paid on our watch are going to be adults and children with disabilities, people in nursing home, hospice care, really human services, right? Because those are the folks who government was established. If we do nothing else right, the one thing we should do right is take care as a government of our most vulnerable populations and make sure that the sick and, the elderly, the infirm have the care that they need from the government that they would not be able to afford to do on their own because they can't walk, they can't talk, they can't speak for themselves. They need an advocate, and that advocate can be the controller. So that's what we've tried to do. We also, of course, prioritize paying down all of our debt service. And you hear me talk about that. I think you can be morally correct and fiscally sound at the same time. So we can prioritize the most vulnerable and at the same time prioritize paying down our debt service so that our credit doesn't take any further downgrades. Make sure that we don't skip on any pension payments, because if we did, our credit would take another hit and we can't afford any additional hits. And make sure that the outside market still sees Illinois as a sound investment, because the controller makes sure to pay the bills on time and to never default on debt service. So after meeting those core obligations of debt service, our K through 12 education spending, we try to prioritize university spending every chance we get. And of course, our most vulnerable populations, then, everything else is in that kind of more of the middle to the back of the line. And I can triage, if you want to think about it. That's why I use the Jimmy Stewart line that I can't pay everybody they're owed. When we owe $16 billion and we have not more than 30 seconds worth of money in a rainy day fund for operations of the state, there's just not enough money to go around. There's no way I can pay $16 billion worth of bills when I have no money coming in. So I would have to tell people that, like Jimmy Stewart, I know you're owed $2,000, but I can only give you $2. Or what is it that you really need? What is it that you need to survive today? And I'll try to get you that. And that was kind of what it was like to be me, especially the first 2 years, going on 3. And now I'm in my 5th year, and we've gotten the bill backlog from what was almost $17 billion down to $3.2 billion. I couldn't be prouder. My oldest voucher on hand is from 2 days ago to outside vendors. So we're well within the 30-day payment cycle. I don't think anyone in their right mind would have thought that I would be able to make a statement like that just 5 years into my term, 2 of which were still under Bruce Rauner, essentially 3 years post Bruce Rauner, that we could get that bill backlog under control. Is really a testament to focus, dedication, and incredible staff that I work with that really buys into my vision for how we prioritize the needs of the people and the state's finances, and they're not mutually exclusive.
You probably have a better big picture perspective on Illinois' finances than anyone. I mean, you see the money coming in and going out. And I think a lot of people are somewhat uncertain about really where we stand, because a year ago, it seemed like with COVID bearing down on us and, what appeared to be a threat of even an economic depression, it was like, oh my goodness. There's been a strong policy response in Washington and Springfield. The economy is doing much better than I think most had expected. And you were saying you're able to pay the bill backlog down dramatically, but I think people are uncertain whether Illinois' structural challenges have been addressed, or whether this is just kind of a kind of a caffeine high that we've gotten a lot of money, thrown at us, and we're using it to keep the economy going strong, but we haven't addressed the fundamental issues. So speak about Illinois' structural budget challenges.
That's a great point. And I've been very clear to say that while we should celebrate the progress that we've made right now, we are nowhere near out of the woods yet in terms of saying that we're fiscally stable and times are great. They're not. We're far from that. We still have a tremendous unfunded pension liability that is like an albatross over our necks. But besides that, in terms of the bill backlog itself, I mean, it is worthy of celebrating that we've gone from almost 17 down to 3.2, 3.5 to 4 billion. Any of that is within a 30-day payment period. And that's awesome. The last time, to put this in perspective, John, that we've been this current on paying our bills was in 2001, right before September 11th hit. So it's not like we were there 10 years ago. We weren't there 20 years ago. So I'm very happy of where we're at. I have said, though, that the success of the bill backlog continuing to be manageable is dependent on a balanced budget, right? If we continue to do as in years past, these, phony baloney budgets that are balanced on magic dust, magic beans and pixie dust, we're going to see that bill backlog continue to climb up. To Governor Pritzker's credit, he has not done that the last 2 years. He also has not predicated, the budget on these fake lines of revenue, like selling the Thompson Center or, working with the Senate or whatever. So like, if it doesn't actually, if we can't count on this money, then it's not going in the budget. And that is how they have to look at budgets in the future. We also made it a priority in this year's budget to say that we're going to pay down the borrowing that we did from the Federal Reserve, which is not part of that bill backlog. So when I tell you that we have a $3.2 billion bill backlog, it does not count the 3.6 billion or 3.2 actually that we did from the Federal Reserve specifically, 2 billion and a 1.2 billion loan that we took out during the pandemic. But what I do want to say here is, John, a lot of people think that we did this miraculous job of paying down the bill backlog because we used all this federal money to do so. But we didn't. We haven't even gotten the federal stimulus yet. And that's a really important point to make. This has not happened overnight. The timing of us making the announcement that we got our bill backlog down to within 30 days happens to coincide with all of this talk that you hear nationally about a federal stimulus, but it's been happening over the last 4 years. So as soon as I was able to convince the legislature and essentially shame Governor Rauner, because he did not want to do it, into doing that $6 billion bonding deal back in 2017, that's what started to right the ship, because I kept making the case that, look, if we were to bond out a portion of this $16.7 billion that we are right now, taxpayers are paying 12% interest on because all of those bills were so late. We were paying 12% interest a year on those bills. Even if we went to the market and got a 6% rate, which is extremely high, it would, be 6 points less than what we're paying today, which would save billions of dollars for taxpayers. But instead, we actually got a 3.5% rate, which over the lifetime of that 12-year bond deal is going to save taxpayers between $4 and $6 billion. That's huge. Now, most people, when they think of bonding, of course, they will frown on it because they think of it as just borrowing to pay grocery bills. But in this case, we were already borrowing, but we were borrowing from vendors who hadn't been paid, and they just wanted to get paid. They didn't really care about the interest. So we're paying 12% on being deadbeats when we could refinance that, if you want to think about it that way, as if you refinance your home for a much lower rate that ends up saving you millions or thousands of your homeowner, in this case, billions if you're state taxpayers. So, and then how we leveraged that $6 billion and turned it closer to $9 billion, because we took that $6 billion and every dollar that we could match with a federal match. So example, a Medicaid bill, back then we were getting 50 cents on every dollar. In today's economy with under this president, and even at the end of President Trump's tenure, the federal government tried to help states out a little bit more by upping the reimbursement rate to 56 cents for Illinois. So for every dollar that I spend of any dollar, whether it's borrowed or not, right, I get an extra 56 cents. And so you stretch the value of that dollar. And that is what has helped us year after year get down to where we are today. But ultimately, those loans are, if you want to think about the bonding deal, for sure saved us billions. The short-term borrowing helped us to really tackle chipping away at the rest of the bill backlog. But we're going to pay that borrowing back well before it's due, so that taxpayers won't be on the hook for up to about $100 million in what would have been interest payments on those loans. So we really, I think, done a masterful job of taking advantage of low rate opportunities for us to borrow from the federal government that would not have been available to us if we were going to the market because of the credit rating, unfortunately, that Illinois has under 2 years of the former governor. So, it's a matter of knowing what financial tools you have available and putting them to best use, ultimately saving taxpayers money in the process and getting us on stronger fiscal footing. But to your point, there is a structural deficit, which means that on any given year, just trying to meet the core obligations of the state, like K through 12 spending, Medicaid, all of our healthcare payments, right? The things that are basic that government should do, public safety, human resources, all of those buckets. We're not talking about any bells and whistles here. We're just talking about turning the lights on, making sure that those buildings are offering the services they're supposed to. Even with all of that, we don't have enough revenue coming in on a year-to-year basis to cover just those most basic expenses. Forget about bells and whistles, right? So that's what we mean when we talk about a structural deficit. And so historically, over the last few years, Illinois has had about a $3.5 to $4 billion structural deficit. That's why so many of us wanted the fair tax to pass, because that would have brought in about $3.5 billion, which would have helped to stop the bleeding, right, of dollars that go out the door when we don't have enough money coming in. And again, these are for basic services from state government. And until we do change the taxing structure to one that provides for a more progressive rate, I believe Illinois is going to have to continue to manage this deficit somehow, and it's going to continue to impact the bill backlog in a negative direction. So, I'm hopeful that with time, people figure that out, that we're not helping by not passing things like the fair tax because we're not closing that structural deficit. And for all those folks who say that, well, our property taxes are too high, that's exactly why you should vote for a progressive income tax, because one of the reasons why your property taxes are so high is because the state of Illinois, because of that structural deficit, does not have enough money to invest in education at the level that we're supposed to. And so when every year we chronically invest less than we should in public education, then those local taxing bodies have to resort to the property tax to create the revenues that they need to keep your kids educated in the best possible way. So Illinois does not carry its fair share of the financial burden in investing in education. Therefore, your property taxes go up. If we're able to close that structural deficit, put more money towards, our fair share towards education, then you could even argue that property taxes should go down because those taxing bodies wouldn't need as much revenue coming into them, therefore could actually cut you a break. But Illinois doesn't set property tax rates. Local taxing bodies do, but they do it because they have no choice given Illinois' dysfunction when it comes to state funding and that structural deficit still being there year to year. Make sense?
That's great. No, and in fact, we have several questions that have been emailed in. And the first one goes right to this point. It's William from Carbondale asking why you think voters rejected the fair tax amendment. And what do you think has to happen for them to view the tax change differently?
Sure, that's a great question. I think voters rejected that tax amendment because voters weren't necessarily voting on a tax amendment. They were voting on trust. And I think that there's a massive lack of distrust in government. And I think that the opponents to the fair tax used a lot of misinformation, factually completely inaccurate, yet it was easy to sell to the public because the public doesn't trust us. They don't trust government. They don't trust that their taxes aren't going to go up. The irony, of course, being that if you were able to pass the fair tax and close that structural deficit, there would be no need to increase taxes anywhere in the near future. I mean, who knows what could happen a decade from now, but there would be zero need or desire from the legislature to increase taxes because that structural deficit would be the only reason why we have to raise taxes. And trust me, as a former legislator, the last thing on earth you want to do is have to vote for a tax increase. So for anyone out there who thinks that we enjoy voting for tax increases, it's like political suicide. Nobody wants to vote for a tax increase. But when there's no other choice, because either seniors get the care they need or children get to go to school, you're left with really bad choices. Closing the structural deficit is a good thing. And being able to say we have enough money to invest in education at the appropriate level so that your property taxes don't have to do the paying for schools and they can actually see a break, that's a win-win for everybody. But when everyone has grown so distrustful of government, that's what was on the ballot, I think, personally, on the Fair Tax Amendment. People didn't trust that even if they passed that, their taxes wouldn't go up. I truly believe there'd be no reason for taxes to go up had we passed that Fair Tax Amendment. But unfortunately, it didn't pass. We're stuck now with a continuing structural deficit, and that's not a good thing.
Kathy from Oak Park asked how the pandemic affected the state's short and long-term budget priorities.
So was that Kathy?
Yeah.
Yeah, Kathy. So on a short-term basis, it became the priority, right? As controller, I had to bend over backwards and do everything humanly possible to make sure that we were addressing the needs of the pandemic, our first responders, our frontline healthcare workers. You may have heard or not, but I'll tell you in case you missed it, that the controller was in national news two or three different times, one even on Anderson Cooper, where we talked about how one of my employees got in her car and drove 2.5 hours north from Springfield, pulled over at a McDonald's parking lot and handed over a check for $3 million to a vendor we had never met in order to secure critical PPE for our frontline workers. And thankfully that we got the shipment, everything was okay. We haven't had any instances of fraud, but this is the environment that we were working on, because if she didn't get in her car that day, in that moment, he wouldn't have been able to get to his bank in time to deposit that check, and told us that he was going to sell those products to Louisiana, right? Instead. So you had all these states competing against each other for things like ventilators and N95 masks and goggles and face shields and gloves and sanitizer. It was insane in the first couple months. It felt like we were in the wild, wild west, and it was a bidding war among states. And so you might win that day and get that order, but then you kind of think about it and you think, okay, well, Illinois won today, but that means a whole lot of people are going to die in another state that didn't get these ventilators or didn't get this order through. And you just feel sick, honestly. So, when I think about Illinois having to procure life-saving equipment or body bags or things of that nature, it's heartbreaking. And that was the priority in the heat of the pandemic, was making sure that we kept as many people alive, and that we would coordinate closely with the governor's procurement team on making sure that their needs were being met through the controller's office. So I'm super proud of Ellen Andrus, who got in her car and drove, of Cortez Gillespie, another one of my directors, who got in his car a day later and drove and pulled over at a road ranger about 2.5 hours north as well for a similar scenario. And those are the type of things that we had to do to be responsive. We also realized that, because of the pandemic, the federal government moved the filing deadline for taxes from April 15th to July 15th. And that blew a massive hole in the state's budget during such a critical period of time. Just so you know, from like a nuts and bolts running the controller's office perspective, the best month of the entire year for us in collecting revenues is the month of April. This is when we were in the middle of a lockdown. So having access to billions of dollars in revenues would have been really helpful to us during that period. But instead of getting money, we lost money because taxpayers didn't have to file until July, which means we didn't get to see revenues come into the state until July. So we had a massive hole in our budget at the worst possible time. That is why we had to rely on borrowing from the Federal Reserve at a lower rate, just to get us through that month of April and May, which typically would be our best months. So, it did put our office again in a situation where we felt like this was a crisis. But I will tell you this, I did not enjoy a minute of the horrible crisis that was self-inflicted on the state of Illinois during the Rauner years. But I certainly learned a ton. And I could say with full confidence that I was the only controller in the entire country who had just recently come off of having to navigate their state through the worst fiscal crisis in their history. So a pandemic kind of felt like another day under the other governor, but in terms from a financial perspective, I felt like we can handle it. People should just worry about people keeping their families safe and themselves safe. We were going to totally help this governor also get through his first term here, having to take on a pandemic, right? So it was a rude awakening for Governor Pritzker, who I think did the best job that anybody could hope a governor could do in trying to get us through this. But it's very difficult, and it's really easy to Monday morning quarterback and say all the things you do differently to make it better. But I'm very proud of the job that he did, and I'm very proud of the job that our office did. But healthcare, Kathy, became the number one priority, clearly as it should be in the middle of a global pandemic, which, by the way, we're not out of yet.
Well, James from Brookfield plunges into Illinois constitutional history and talks about the Orville Hodge scandal of decades ago, which resulted in the office of the comptroller from the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution of 1970. And he's just wondering, do you think that the Constitution made the right call in 1970 to create separate comptroller and treasurer offices?
Yes, 100%. Was that James?
Yeah.
Thank you, James. Great point. And I don't think enough people know about why we even have a controller and a treasurer. Just for point of constitutional obligations here, the state controller is the state's chief fiscal and accountability officer. And my job is to pay all the state's bills, to manage the state's finances. I manage the state's fiscal accounts. The state treasurer is responsible for investing the state's money. Whenever you get a check from the controller, you'll see that it has two signatures on it. It has mine as state controller, and it has Michael Frerich's as the state treasurer. We give each other a checks and balance on that specific check, right? If you want to think about it that way. And the reason that these offices were created separate and independent of each other is because back in 1956, a gentleman by the name of Orville Hodge, you should Google it, it's a really interesting story. Orville Hodge was the auditor of public accounts. There was no controller, no treasurer. It was just the auditor of public accounts. And he fulfilled those functions of auditor, controller, and treasurer. And I'm sure you will not be shocked, unfortunately, to know that Mr. Hodge went ahead and, having access to both the money for the state, like the treasurer would, and the checkbook, the way the controller would, wrote himself a lot of checks on the taxpayer's dime, to the tune of what today would be about $56 million worth of checks. He embezzled about $6 million back in 1956, which today in present value would be closer to 60, I think in that 56, 57 range. But in any event, an outrageous amount of money. So he did go to jail, thankfully, but in 1970, the Constitutional Convention came around and they decided to separate those duties to create a strong internal control between the money and the checkbook. And that is 100% a smart thing to do. You'll hear people always say, oh, just consolidate the offices and you'll save millions of dollars. Totally untrue, because number one, the functions are completely different, right? So you'd still need employees to do different functions. I mean, you might save money on the controller, but you would, or on the treasurer, right? If they consolidated one way or the other. But what you'd lose is massive internal controls that there is a reason why these offices were separated to begin with, which is a very valid one. And if you think that this can't happen in Illinois today, just, blink, because just a few years ago in 2012, it happened in Dixon, Illinois, home of Ronald Reagan, where Rita Cromwell, you might remember her because she was the horse lady. She was the state control. She was their Dixon's controller / treasurer, both in one office. And she embezzled, it's like she copycatted Orville Hodge. I think it was $54 million back in 2012 was the value of what she had embezzled. So that happened right here in Illinois. And my last point on this is that the two largest government embezzlement schemes in the history of the United States of America both happened here in Illinois with Orville Hodge and with Rita Cromwell. And, again, that was a very recent case. So the markets, if you want to think about consolidating to save a few million bucks, the markets have expressed that, look, this is a bad thing. Getting rid of internal controls in state finances would be seen as a credit negative for Illinois. And if we were to lose any more credit ratings, that would cost us billions of dollars, or hundreds of millions on any given loan if it's a small one, to billions on a large loan. So it's really just a political talking point that some politicians love to use because it sounds good and people like to hear that. But I believe that taxpayers deserve to hear the truth from us as elected officials. And whether I was a controller or not, I would be advocating for strong fiscal controls for two separate and distinct offices, and to make sure that there is a strong check and balance on each other and the rest of the executive branch.
Well, we'd love to talk to you some more, but I'd like to end maybe with just kind of on a lighter vein about just how you like to relax and decompress. And I saw on your website that you like soccer. We'd like to hear more about your soccer prowess. You're a foodie and also a skydiver. Talk about those three hobbies.
So I love soccer. I've played since I was about 8 years old when we moved to the suburbs. That's where I started. And it got me through, well, it was a passion and a love of my life, right? I always say it was my first love. And my dad was a soccer player before me. And I have a lot of just fun memories growing up with him teaching me how to play, and then being a really good player and playing in high school and then in college and getting a scholarship and all those things, right? Traveling the world. I got to play in Europe when I was 16 on a select team, and it was just super fun. But having said that, I also love spending time with my family. And that might sound boring to people, but it's not to me. It's the best thing in the world for me, is getting time to just spend with my husband and our 8-year-old son. My mom, who I still thankfully have the pleasure of having her with us. She lives with us. She's 85 years old. My brother Joaquin, who I mentioned in the very beginning, you know, who's a Chicago police officer, he now lives with us. And it's kind of a sad story because he unfortunately got very sick from COVID back in November. He turned 56 years old, and I called him to wish him a happy birthday, and he had a cough. And of course I got concerned, but 2 days later, he was fighting for his life at Northwestern Memorial, 41 days in the hospital, a month later in inpatient rehab. And then they discharged him into my care because he needed help, right? So of course I wouldn't have done it any other way, but yeah, that is a sad thing, but it's also nice to have him here and get to see him. And so in terms of relaxing, it's certainly not the relaxing part of my life, but I would say that vacationing to either tropical or cold are my favorite things to do. I love going to a beach and just as much love snowboarding. So that's not maybe on my website, but I really love snowboarding these days. And so people might not find that relaxing. I do. I think it's just beautiful to be on the mountain and just see how nature is so amazing. But also I love to hike and I love to be on a beach like any other normal person probably would. And, but spending time with family and travel, those are the things that I love more than anything.
And is there some skydiving in your past?
Oh, I forgot to say skydiving. Yeah, I love skydiving. It's super fun. I can't wait for the day. And people please do not report me to DCFS. But as soon as my son is old enough, we're going to go for it, you know, like mommy's son, because it's just so cool. There's like nothing like jumping out of a plane, which I know goes against any normal thought, but it is pretty invigorating, exciting, and it's beautiful. So I'm not like a professional skydiver, so I don't want to overplay my skydiving chops, but I definitely love to do it. I wouldn't say it's relaxing, it's invigorating, right? But yeah, like I said, you know, I run towards burning buildings. I jump out of perfectly fine planes. I'm a little bit weird. And I would say that the one perhaps most unique thing about me, if we want to get into like quirky fun things, is that I might be the only elected official that's ever crowd surfed out of a Rage Against the Machine concert. And that was many years ago. Well, I was still elected though at the time, but it was really fun. And I love listening to live music, especially at small little venues or, you know, outdoor live music. So I have a lot of things. I feel like I'm a pretty rounded person who loves new experiences, but for me, it's all centered around family. Like my husband and my son, they're the best. My mom, I still have her and I want to enjoy her as long as I can. And, you know, family, if anything, COVID has just shown me even more than ever how important it is and how blessed we are to still have our loved ones with us, especially if they were able to survive this pandemic. So I really wish the best for everybody. And I hope that everyone takes this pandemic seriously. If you haven't been vaccinated, please don't be afraid to do it. Be afraid of what could happen if you don't. And if you need an example, just look at my brother. He lost both his kidneys. He'll need to be on dialysis for the rest of his life. He had many strokes in his brain. Please don't let that happen to you. Just get the shot. It doesn't hurt. And it can save your life. So I'm hopeful that everyone who's listening has already gotten their shot. But if you're even remotely hesitant, please don't.
Great. Well, Comptroller Mendoza, thank you so much for your time. And we would love, when travel and circumstances allow, to have you come back to Southern Illinois. You've been here before. I saw your talk on YouTube. You did a wonderful job. And, you know, I'm sure students would like to meet you, talk to classes, community. Maybe we could even arrange a skydiving entrance to the region.
Yeah. Awesome. I'm totally in. Let's do it. There's so much open, beautiful land there. Of course, it'd be super fun. And by the way, I'll be there a lot. We've got plans for the very near future to head down to Southern Illinois. And I feel like, you know, now that the restrictions are being lifted, I've been fully vaccinated. I really can't wait to just go see people. And I feel like the best hugs you'll ever get are fully vaccinated hugs, right?
All right. Well, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you soon, Dad.
For sure. I'll see you guys soon. I promise. I love Southern Illinois. You know, I don't just say that, but when I'm in Southern Illinois, I always stay at in Des Moines, right next to the governor's mansion at the Rednars. And that's my home away from home. So I usually am there for a week or two at a time.
Wow. That's a nice place to be. So
beautiful. But Southern Illinois as a whole is beautiful, and I'm no stranger to it. So I'll see you soon. I promise, John.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for watching another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. We will have this interview with the comptroller on our website Monday. So please look at it, send it to family and friends, and show everyone the good work that the comptroller is doing. And thank you for continuing to support the Institute and keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.